Cheveldave. He is a senior consultant at Cognitive Edge. He has lots of credentials, and I'll let you tell him anything else about himself that he wants to.
Yeah, thanks, Barbara. So what I want to do today is sort of level set a little bit with everyone's familiarity and involvement in safety, and it'll help sort of frame. And I'm going to actually start this off by saying right up front, we're going to have actually a dynamic conversation for as much time as we can run. And I'm going to try seed the conversation with sort of ideas and thoughts around safety based on my experiences, as well as the chapter in the book. And we're going to also spend a time to, I'm going to ask you to look at a video I'm going to show. And hopefully we tested it out with Barbara and Jocko with transmission over Zoom, and it was actually coming through carefully. And it's a time lapse of a construction site. And what we're going to do is we're going to use that as sort of the context to focus the conversation around safety, and we're going to explore a series of questions. And what I'll do is I'll switch over to the site. I'll give you an idea how it's going to work. And I know that's probably very small if you're looking in gallery view. So when we're actually on the video, that's actually a video behind that, we'll put a spotlight on it and make it larger. Jocko, do you know how to do that? Why don't we run through just a quick test of that?
I have no idea how to do it.
So you click on the ellipse on the picture, and I think you just select spotlight. Let's just test this out, make sure it works. Actually, if I'm so are you?
Yeah, you should. Yeah, you're co-host, so you should be able to do it.
Okay. Does that force it for everyone to be looking at a large view? Okay, that's good. Now I'm just going to go back, and then so when I remove spotlight, it'll go back on probably Jocko, so you can go back to gallery view if you prefer. And I'm going to come back to myself for a minute. So what we're going to do is the flow of the talk is going to be a bit unusual. I'm not going to sit and speak to 20 minutes of slides and step you through a deck. What I want to do is introduce some of the key concepts behind the article and the book chapter that I co-authored with Gary Wong. And then one of the things I want to say right up front is I actually approach safety purely from a complexity lens, and some experience in my career working as a field engineer in different companies prior to my work with Cognitive Edge. I've been with Cognitive Edge since 2000, well, official capacity, I think it was 07, 08 that I officially joined, but I was working with Dave and the early team as early as 2005. So I came at at safety more because I had an engineering industrial background. And then when we started to do some Cynefin work and facilitation and work particularly with SenseMaker, I started to come in at safety from that end. So the talk and my references, I'm going to have a naive sort of hat in terms of depth of safety experience. But when it comes to complexity, I can draw on my experience in applying the Cynefin framework. So I just want to make that very clear to everyone. That's also the reason I co-authored the chapter with Gary Wong, because he brought in the safety knowledge. So first question for everyone is how many, and I'm not sure which way to ask this, because how many are familiar or have read the book chapter, Cynefin Safety, that I co-authored with Gary Wong? Maybe give me hands up if you've read it. Okay, some that don't have cameras, maybe thumbs up. I'm not sure, I can't really tell. Dan, okay. Yeah, might be half and half, maybe more. I can't tell with those that aren't sharing cameras. The other thing that we're going to do is as we go through, and I'm going to give you, there's going to be short pauses where you're going to have a few minutes, maybe even 5 minutes, to look at the video closely and jot some notes down for yourself. And then we'll come back to plenary, and we're going to have a conversation about some things that we explored the video for. So if you have some note paper nearby, a pen, make sure you have that ready. So the premise of the chapter on safety looked at 3 principles that we wanted to highlight and bring to sort of safety practitioners from any industrial background or any operational type background. is, what do those safety professionals have to keep in mind when they're perhaps first being introduced to the Cynefin framework? And the first key principle we talked about is looking at the system as a whole. Oftentimes, in my engineering background, we used to approach challenging situations, plant operations, by breaking a system into its components, trying to isolate where the problem spaces are, and then focusing in, kind of metaphorically like a surgical scalpel, to perhaps remove the tumor from the patient, and then hopefully the system would self-heal around that and it would come back together and operate well. And what we found in the work that we did around safety is the dominant lens that people were applying was this sort of approach to analyze and determine, find the root cause, and deal with the root cause of safety issues and challenges and remove them and then come back together. And fundamentally in complexity theory is you cannot disaggregate and recombine. What you have to do is you have to bear in mind all of the interconnecting influences that the system has in play. And that includes, and what the value of the Cynefin framework does, is it recognizes that in human systems, we are interacting with layers of systems and subsystems, many of which are ordered, validly ordered and structured, be them clear, be them complicated. But then we have emergent patterns of behavior issues, attitudes, right, that can encroach. People can get blindsided as well because the attention is moved away. And so we have these interconnecting systems. So that was one of the key principles, is how can we work with the system as a whole? The thing that triggered this awareness of needing to work with the system as a whole is some early workshops we did, some of them I did with Gary Wong, is where we had safety professionals map their tools on the Cynefin framework, and they identified that the majority of the tools were actually working off an assumption of order. In other words, the one I mentioned earlier, root cause analysis, fundamentally assumes that the system that we're analyzing is ordered and structured. So that comes with that assumption. The other thing that we mapped on Cynefin, and this is what the article speaks to, is we then asked the safety professionals to map where they would place incidents or various aspects of the incidents, like what actually happened. And what we found was a lot of those situations were mapping into the complex domain. So I'll never forget one workshop we were running in Vancouver, and we had a small group of practitioners from different parts of North America come into Vancouver for it. Is this aha moment that they came to realize is they said that, predominantly we're tool heavy and we're well equipped in our safety management systems in the ordered and the complicated domain and the clear domain, but we have no tooling in the complex domain. And yet all of our issues, human factors, right, challenging, complex sort of contributing factors to these safety incidences were happening in the complex domain. So the first sort of key principle that we wanted to highlight in the chapter is, how do we actually absorb the whole? The other thing I'll mention, and again, this is drawing from my knowledge of working with people who are safety experts, be it Gary Wong, Marion Kiley is another one in our network, as well as others, is it also found some resonance with this whole safety one, safety two approach. How many are familiar with safety one, safety two in an industry? Bowdoin is, I assume. Any others? No, some aren't. Barbara is. So safety one, and this I can ask Bowdoin to explain further if I make any errors. But my understanding on safety one is the focus is on what went wrong, right? Where are the critical incidents occurring? Let's fix what went wrong so it will never happen again, and we will be safer because of it. And the idea there around safety two is, because fortunately in our high risk work environments, for the majority of the time, things are operating very safely, right? So you have an environment that is probably 99% plus in terms of just absolute working time is working in a safe environment. So we're ignoring where things are working well. And where are we perhaps, when things are working well, what are we observing? How are we triggering ourselves as a system to alert where risk is encroaching, right? Which is also on that boundary of things working well. Because if workers actually spot, have a near miss, if it's observed, it'll be caught, or if it's a recorded near miss. But oftentimes things go on unsaid, and near misses happen, and the system sort of auto corrects, and it actually keeps the whole environment safe. So safety 2 said, how do we actually put an attention on when things are working well? And the key principle I talked about, one is working with the whole system, is, if we obsess about now safety 2, only look at things when things are working well, we've actually negated the learning that happens when failure occurs, right? And safety incidents happen, and God forbid, fatalities. And so what we're saying, working with the whole system, is in that statement is we're saying, look, you have to actually have safety 1 and 2, and you have to look at the interplay between when things are working well and when we cross this boundary of safety risk actually having an impact in the form of accidents, injuries, and fatalities, and how do we manage the whole system? So that's really key principle, number 1. Number 2 is something that we've really taught and emphasized in complexity training and our work with applying Cynefin, is how do we have to accept that we have to work with the present state. So in particular, when you are working in the complex domain, you need to recognize that we cannot engineer a future state. So how do we then work within the present? And to my mind, in terms of safety, what that means is, how do we understand our sort of culture and attitudes and behavior patterns as it relates to safe operations? And how can we understand our predispositions, in other words, our inclinations, and how we are likely systematically to behave or deal with emergent risk, right, as a company, and understand those characteristics to set a path forward to deal with complex safety challenges. So that's really about challenging the dominant mode, where a new initiative or a new approach to safety is written up in a best-selling book or some series of case studies or research, and executive teams get onto the bandwagon of saying, look, we need to create an ideal state. We need to set a program. They'll often give it a name. This is goal 0, and it's going to be a 3-year plan. And they set a destination to achieve a certain safe operating state. And what we're saying is actually it's anything that's dealing with the complex issue of safety in the environment, is you need to actually work with the characteristics of your organization. Even though that you might be in a construction firm operating, building mega large projects, infrastructure projects, or buildings in New York City, might have similarity to, say, building, large infrastructure buildings in Sydney, Australia. There may be differences in the work environments and the sort of cultural attitudes that have to impact. So working from and understanding the present state, in particular how it deals with complex issues, is absolutely critical. And the third point is recognizing that a series of small actions has the potential to create significant improvements. So how do we work with incremental actions that are in areas of the whole system that we identify that need our attention, right, that have the potentiality of having a significant impact? And the challenging thing is in the desire, especially in highly technical environments, and a lot of industrial environments and large, complicated construction sites tend to be dominated with a mindset of order and detailed structure. It's a hard thing to recognize that we have to try things not knowing the ultimate impact that we can have. And so safe to fail in terms of creating a portfolio approach and dealing with complex issues is absolutely critical in working in safety, right, with Cynefin, because I think safe to fail on a high-risk construction site has a far different impact than, say, doing organizational change of, say, a a company that's primarily focused on knowledge work. Think about large software development or something like that, because the levels of risk in terms of personal harm are significantly different. So the third point in key principles is how can we actually get individuals, sort of safety leads in these companies, recognizing the value of actually doing these small interventions that are complexity informed, that are Cynefin informed, that could have a profound impact on their safety performance. So those three key principles is what we brought into play. And I think if I can say it, is there is an overall envelope sort of to the chapter is increasing situational awareness. So all of those three principles do relate to situational awareness and how do we actually see our environment, right? And how do we facilitate awareness and learning in ways that we could trigger sort of their innate human capability to keep our workplaces safe and operating smoothly. So with that, before we jump into an exercise, I wanted to maybe have a chance to get a two-way flow of interaction and any questions that come up from that. If any of you have read the chapter and have questions, or those that perhaps haven't read it, but maybe how I quickly summarize things may have presented. So any questions I can take right now before we take a look at a video.
I have a quick one. You had mentioned what I generally refer to as the current state and the emphasis of that over goals. Now, when we're talking about safety, sort of a two-parter a little bit, is are you dissuading? It seems to me that the system is dispositionally set up in such a way to encourage those goal future oriented. And I think one of the ways that manifests is the hyper focus on metrics of some kind of measurement, which almost leads into that dispositionality of the system again to go to that future state or to amplify it. Does that come up in any of the stuff that that you're interested in when you go into the safety measure in these organizations?
So I'm not sure I understand fully the question, Jocko, or the topic. So you mentioned KPIs, right, or measures,
Yep.
Right? So one of the ways that we deal with this is KPIs are completely valid in the complicated and clear domains, right? The nature of the measures change when you're in the complex domain, right? So I would put dispositionality as a characteristic of a system that is complex, and how I monitor. I'm careful here not to, because you can't measure. I've got an engineering background, so I tend to look at measures as being some sort of absolute. So you establish some scale and you link it to some absolute sort of reference point. Whereas dispositionality is, I consider that more differential. So it's relative to a prior state or a characteristic or quality. So I tend to not conflate KPIs and measures, which are, in my opinion, applicable in the order domain, versus dispositionality and.
Oh no, I was differentiating the two. I was just saying the system itself being complex it tends towards this idea of metrics, and using the metrics amplify that future state that pulls them in that direction. It pulls them out of that kind of looking at the current state. That's what I meant.
Yeah, I think it can, because what happens is if you find organizations that are trying to measure things that are inherently complex, is what happens is they start to realize that the measures actually are harmless at best, but otherwise are impacting the patterns and behavior and what people are paying attention to. So what happens is, and a simple example might be, is I've worked a little bit or consulted with people I've trained that work in environments that are in high rates of turnover, but are at a high rate of turnover with a much more junior staff coming into a high-risk operating environment. And what happens, the real concern of some of the senior staff or employees that work in that is they're seeing that the junior staff are relying heavily on formal training and the procedures, which is actually blinding them or actually biasing what they're paying attention to, right? So, and measures can do the same thing. Is just because you look at those measures, Give you another case, an example. There's a utility company not far from where I'm currently living, that many years, or was it probably 7-8 years ago, they had not just one fatality. I think they had a series of 2 or 3, and they happened really quickly over time. But some of their incident indicators were actually indicating that they were doing well. In other words, their indicators were indicating that their safety impact, the thought, was actually having a high effect. And so this is these fatalities actually shock them, because the non-linearity, like all of a sudden you think you're actually doing well, but then you have in this case, a couple of very severe adverse events, and they're trying to say, what happened? How can we, are the measures that we had actually indicating that we are making headway and improving our safety effectiveness?
Yeah, that's exactly what I was referring to. It takes their eye off the ball. It's a distraction almost.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. And one of the things that remember I talked right at the end is awareness, right? And learning is absolutely key, and disrupting and getting people more aware. So getting them out of their really small or tight confined work cells, and that might be their sort of sphere of operations, right? To see widely, and more critically is, how do I see it from multiple perspectives, right? So I become self-aware if I'm contributing to a potentially unsafe environment, either for myself or for my coworkers, right?
Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions do I have anyone from a safety field? I know Bowdoin, I've had lots of conversations with Bowdoin about safety. Anyone else here has responsibility in safe operations?
Yeah, I have some responsibilities, Michael, in tower climbing, building telecommunication sites.
Okay.
I've got some questions coming up. I'm waiting to see where you go with it. But I would say that every fatality that I've been adjacent to, so none of my staff have had a fatality, but the ones that I've seen have been someone not following a clear process. But I think the complexity comes in is what is driving them, such as productivity figures, because most of them are subcontractors. So
okay.
what are the drivers that's making them feel that they should skip these very clear safety procedures, like wear a harness and clip on at all times? So I'm waiting to see where you go with this, and it's been really interesting so far. So I want to see where that goes.
Yeah, let's. I mean, some of the exercise with the video is probably going to be informed by your work in that area, but it really is. I mean, one of the things that I've gained appreciation, not just from my schooling in engineering, which gives you sort of the book smarts of how unsafe some operating environments are. But then when you actually get field experience and you have near misses yourself, or you're involved and terrible being adjacent to some fatalities, which I unfortunately was at one point in my career. And it really strikes home. And then the gravitas of understanding, well, why did that break down? When people should have known better, right? And yet still, someone for some reason put themselves or someone else in harm's way because they weren't paying attention. Yeah. Anyone else question or comment?
Well, the question, I'm not directly concerned with safety, but I have a client who is. They're a mining concern, and they've had a couple of waste dam failures in the last decade that have had disastrous consequences. And the question becomes, how do you, when you're dealing with that level of thing, how do you know what to pay attention to? Because you're dealing with something it's almost unprecedented. Because the last time something like that happened was 80 years ago, 100 years ago. So you're no longer even looking in the right direction.
Yeah. So and that one really speaks to, and again, these principles that we included in our chapter sound effective, but it really, when it comes down to practice, that's where it starts to, the details start to get difficult to kind of think through. So working with the system as a whole is one thing, but how do we heighten our awareness of the system as a whole, and being able to understand what you kind of refer to there, Jim, is how do we do so we can understand the dynamics of the system, and we have the right triggering mechanisms in place where our attention could be triggered to pay attention to an area that's presenting itself as an emerging high risk, whether it's a catastrophic failure of a piece of equipment, or a mission. If we think back to the two shuttle disasters, right? Because we can go backwards and look and connect the dots and see where mistakes were made, but our human fallibility and our inability sometimes to spot the weak signals, but then oftentimes our inability when we do spot the weak signals is we have a next sort of almost a second order risk, is we can actually justify that what we spotted away and not paying attention to it and not take action on it, right? So, and that refers to if some of you on the meetup here call have followed Dave Snowden's work, he referred to some research that he did, some of which was done jointly with Gary Klein, who, if you're familiar with his work, Sources of Power and Naturalistic Decision-Making. Gary Klein studied paramedics, firefighters, police, military, engineers as well, and how decision-making happens in the natural world. And Dave was working on elements and continues on what he calls the see, attend, act model. Do we see the weak signals, right? Because sometimes, and this is where the cognitive science comes in, is if our attention is focused, and this relates to what Jocko raised earlier, if our attention is focused on KPIs or certain measures, and those measures are very complicated, and we're narrowing our perspective, is we become blind to the peripheral sort of weak signals, right? So do we see the potential weak signals? The next one is, do we pay attention to it, right? And the third one, are we ready to take action, right? So if we think about economic implications, everyone knows the Volkswagen Dieselgate issue, right? There were, in hindsight, there were people that saw, right, knew what was being done, right, but weren't ready to actually take action on it, right? So they saw it, they were paying attention to it, chose not to say, right? And these are things that then have the potential to propagate into some serious issue, because, and one of the things that is difficult in safety is it's easy to blow a little whistle. Let me use this analogy. In other words, if we're making observation as an employee group, and something is tipping in the wrong direction, right? And a clear example of this might be is I've got fairly experienced linemen, say working in electrical utility or distribution, and some new hires come in and they see their cavalierish sort of macho, predominantly, it might be a predominantly male cohort coming in and taking risks unnecessarily, right? So nothing's happened, but I see that. It's easy for me to maybe raise a flag, but how can those small whistles, right, be more effectively coordinated so that if a whole bunch of small whistles start blowing and they start blowing around a certain topic, that gets signaled in the right way so someone pays attention to it and action is taken, right? Because the cost of intervention, right, and the implications are far more effective to take action sooner rather than dealing with lineman fatalities, occurring on the job. So that's part of the challenge is I want to talk on that a bit later, is how can we effectively monitor the whole, right? And that's the difficulty. And one of the first tips to mention on this is recognizing we can't monitor the whole. So in other words, we can improve, but your view is always partial. And fundamentally is the question for safety experts that I hope that the book chapter that prompted this talk will trigger in some safety execs and managers, is that even though we can only pay attention to a partially of the system, are what our current safety managements we're doing too narrow, and we need to expand how we actually can monitor and pay attention. And that's where the key is. And I'll talk on that a bit later. So everyone ready to do a bit of an exercise? Everyone's got a piece of pen and a paper?
All
right.
Do we need safety glasses for this?
Yeah, you might if you really look close at your screen. Maybe ones with blue filter, right? So you protect your eyes. All of us are suffering from computer screen strain. So what I'm going to show is a video here momentarily. Well, I can bring it up. And what I'll do is the first ask is, and I'm going to go on the assumption everyone's got to be familiar with the Cynefin framework. But I want you to grab a piece of paper, and maybe you could sketch the Cynefin framework. And I'm working with the 5 domain, the predominant, the more original. I'm going to ignore liminality for a minute, although that don't let that inhibit you from bringing it into the conversation if you want to explore a little bit of it. So we've got the clear domain, the complicated domain, complex, chaotic, and of course the confused domain. So what we're going to do is the video I'm going to show is a time lapse of a construction site. Looks like any high-rise major building construction site. I'm not even sure where this one's from. I just grabbed it from one of the free royalty-free sites that make these available. And what we're going to do is I want you to basically look at that and identify as many risks as you can. We'll run this for 5 minutes, Jocko, Barbara. And what I want you to do is identify risk by domain, right? So, and if you need to ask yourself, because we know that perspectives are at play here, take the perspective of a construction worker or the site construction manager. Right. So what would you consider? You might not be a construction project manager or a construction worker specialist, but I want you to kind of put yourself in that role and explore the nature of the hazards. And then we're gonna look at this video a few times, but we're gonna ask different questions and look at the site in different ways. But the first one is I want to see if we can identify hazards that are clear hazards. Risks of safety, complicated ones, complex ones, and let's say any actually risk that you might consider as confused. That might be interesting. If it's chaos, you can actually go to hypotheticals. If this were to happen, there would be potential chaos, right? So the video, I don't think there aren't any. I didn't actually take a close look, so maybe someone might find something that's borderline or in chaos. Okay, any questions on the task? So at the end of 5 minutes, you should have a few risks identified across the domains in Cynefin. So let me get you going. So I'll bring this up as a spotlight in case. Let me pin. All right, is the video clear for everyone? So the first one is a bit fast, and I'll slow it down in a minute. So let's just take a look. So that's a real fast one. And it's going to loop, so you have a bit of time. So it's you'll see it repeating. So let's just slow it down a bit. Okay. You want to start a timer, Barbara?
Sure. 5 minutes?
Yeah, let's give it about 5.
Okay, great.
Is everyone, sorry, I have a note saying that the video is not full size. Does it need to be bigger for everyone? Barbara, is it full size? It's okay for you, Luke? Okay.
I can see it full size. I have
Okay.
my view is speaker view, and I've collapsed the gallery, so it might be.
I've got to spotlight it. Sorry, I put it on a pin. Let me see if I can spotlight it. Sorry, guys. 1 second. There we go. Thanks, Baldwin. Is that full size now for everyone?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay, we're just about at 30 seconds. Let's finish up. This is very hypnotic, Michael. I found myself just sort of like, I'll just watch this for a while, and then I was like, oh, it's 30 seconds. Okay.
Yeah, it's an interesting vantage point.
Yeah.
Cool.
All right.
All right, what I want to do is open your mic if anyone wants to share some or all of their risks, hazards that they identified by domain. Who wants to go first? I'm going to remove spotlight.
Let me know what happens. All right, Mom.
Oh, let's go back.
Bye.
Okay, who's going to be the fearless leader to kick off?
Don't make me do this. You know that never ends well.
I'll just make a quick comment. I struggled immensely.
Okay. Did you find any of those? A struggle and nothing, no risks identified?
Well, as a person that has no clue what is a risk, I have a bunch of ideas, sneaky suspicions that I wrote down that are probably all wrong.
No, there's no right or wrong.
Okay, well, just to kind of tee us off, I guess one of the things that occurred to me was that you've got these cars zipping by on occasion in a road in between the two construction sites, and that kind of struck me as potentially a risk.
Yep. And that one, in terms of, I've just got a few statistics. It's in preparation for the call. I was going to look through a few, but being struck by moving vehicles, when was this? I think this is related to some statistics, 2015, 2016 in Canada, but 13% of all workplace fatalities are last 10 years, right? So we're struck by vehicle, right? So you spotted something there, clearly.
Related to that, the one I think I noticed, again, not knowing what to look for is could be a pro or a con, I suppose, but it looked like the top crane didn't have a barrier on it. People were walking behind it. The blue one, whereas the one in the foreground did, and it looked like there was quite a few people
Okay, interesting.
walking behind the crane while it was moving.
Hard to tell with this vantage point. I mean, usually most construction sites, any heavy machinery like that has serious sort of markers and rules around proximity when they're operating. But it's an interesting insight. Back to the earlier comment on fast-moving traffic, any identification of the type of risk by Cynefin domain?
Yeah, I actually ultimately ended up deciding to put the traffic in the chaotic domain. And that's only because, as far as I understand what the chaotic domain is that there is no connection between cause and effect. And while that's, I mean, if it's certainly if you're a worker there or you're a manager there, you're running the crane, or you're a delivery guy or whatever your job is, if some car busts in at 80 miles an hour, a truck or whatever, maybe they're carrying cargo, maybe fuel, who knows what's happening. I think it might, and to someone else on their side of the highway, it might seem completely complicated. It's a little bit more than just clear. It's a little more, it's just more to it than that. But that's why I ultimately ended up putting the highway in the chaotic domain, because we have, at least as far as I can tell, no control and no visibility or any perception into what is happening. And that's how I got chaotic.
Interesting. Anyone want to comment on that? Anyone have thoughts contrary to that?
My take on it was a little different than just the traffic thing. What I really focused on was the merge of the construction vehicles into traffic, because I think I saw a couple of blind spots there, and these are very large vehicles that are merging into what is clearly in some cases non-commercial traffic. And so I put that in the complex domain, because those kinds of merging situations, there are city and state regulations, there's traffic laws, there's all sorts of things, there's a regulatory environment around this. Yeah. But there's also the safety of your workers and the safety of the other drivers to be taken into account. And the other drivers, no matter how safe your drivers are, the other drivers are a wild card.
Okay. Before I comment, I want to give some others a chance to comment. Did anyone else look at the traffic and make some comments on risks related to the movement of traffic in the video?
Yeah, I thought traffic was more in the simple or clear domain because it seemed like the domain of best practice, like wait for a light before you cross the street.
Mm-hmm.
So that left aside I agree with the other gentleman that a car breaking through the barrier would be the chaotic domain, but
Got it.
that's the less common experience. I'm guessing that the more common experience is somebody deciding to race the traffic and not succeeding.
Interesting. Okay. Anyone else want to comment on the traffic or other?
I'd agree with Barbara in terms of the merging of the construction vehicles, that this was happening at somewhat unpredictable intervals. So depending upon one's perspective, if one is in the construction vehicle, that is a difficult merge. You need a separate coordinator or enabling constraint, as it were, such as, put up a stoplight at each end to give them an opportunity to safely merge, or have somebody out there controlling traffic, as we often see on road repair type of construction sites. So I was agreeing with Barbara in terms of placing in the complex domain that these were kind of emergent risks, depending upon other things outside of a linear flow.
Okay.
Moving away from the traffic thing for the moment, I was particularly perturbed by the kind of red crane in the foreground, the red cabin crane, and his swinging the load over an open work area with no obvious protection for the workers. And depending upon what that load is, things can come off the load. The load can just drop, or any number of things. I found that particularly disturbing, but I was placing that in a clear mode since I felt it was such an obvious linear thing.
Yeah, I looked at that as well, and it's hard to tell again from this one sort of high level vantage point, if the actual what do they call it? It's the potential fall zone, right, of the heavy lift equipment is actually being violated with anyone that's walking under it. I'm not sure Luke or anyone else who's perhaps on the call here who's got some experience by it. But I know that, that's obviously a very serious infraction if you've got violation of people walking under fall zones.
The fact that this is taking place in the open air means that it is potential subject to the elements. So then it can very easily go into a sequence of dangerous events. So we would find ourselves in the chaotic domain. You could think about lightning, sudden change in weather with storm bursts that could lead to flying material. Lightning could lead to fire, could lead to, people being injured and kind of panic response, and that could lead then to temporarily, at least, a chaotic domain. And it looked like it would then be difficult to get access. So I don't know how they would be able to get access to the site, although I would expect that they would have thought that through. But it's in the open air, so.
Yeah. One of the things that, and those are sort of external factors, Baudouin, right? That the video doesn't show it, but that's where the potentiality of something unexpectedly interfering with people's attention, awareness, or ability to do their work. One of the things that before we let go of the traffic flow, one of the things that struck me when I was, thinking about using this video for the talk here is there's a lot of barricades, right? Even for foot traffic, right? There's barricades that are holding sort of space, whether it's movement by particular equipment, be it the cranes, be it the traffic. And in particular, I'm not sure if it's just circumstantial, but the high speed street, right, that's in the top end of the screen, there's some serious barricades holding that off, because to your point, Kit, any unexpected, right, breach of that barrier, right? If there's a traffic accident that is, happens unexpectedly, it's unacceptable to have this work site be subject to, projectiles and vehicles and various body parts flying into this space, right? So that to me, where I place a lot of these barriers where they're very, very clear. So that's where I had a lot of things in clear myself, right? A lot of these barricades, whether if they're for fall hazards or vehicles breaching, or they're just trying to prevent foot traffic, especially the crane that's in the foreground here, right? And it's not just foot traffic, but those barricades are there to prevent any vehicular sort of crossing that boundary or barrier. Did anyone?
Yeah, I made note of, with regard to the two cranes, I made note of what seemed like it should be in the clear domain, but that was violated, which is the arc that the two cranes were swinging in. And the one in the foreground, I think was the red one, swung across what seemed to me like should be best practice to not violate that space that the green crane was in.
Yeah, and if anyone's worked with, in crane environments, that's one of the things I put actually in the complicated domain. It's just crane coordination, right? Because there is, it's sort of similar to, if you're familiar with the training air traffic controllers have to go through. You need a deep sense, almost a natural skill or a talent of actually thinking in three space. Because if you don't have that, you're not going to cut it to being an air traffic controller. It's almost the same, probably the same thing for crane coordination and just understanding logistics of crane movements and managing that on site, especially if you're dealing with heavy lift situations, right? So I put that risk in the complicated domain, given the degree of coordination. Does anyone else have anything in, before I share a couple that I picked up in the complex domain? Anyone pick up anything in the, particularly in the clear, complicated domains or complex?
I would comment about the delivery truck, the crane truck in the bottom left corner.
Yeah.
It was pretty outside of normal process. There was a gentleman on top of the crane truck rigging loads, and it was moved as each load was moved off. He didn't get off the flatbed. He stayed there while it swung back. You really should be getting off the flatbed at that point. So I'd call that clear, because it's a pretty clear, straightforward process.
Yeah.
There was a lot of foot traffic between that really narrow space between the main crane and that delivery truck, which you would probably normally put up some temporary barriers while that truck was actually doing the delivery. Again, I would call that clear. And then the other thing that I observed was, like everyone else said, the crane loads being swung over the workers in the main pit. That's common but not desirable. It's probably got a fairly low probability of turning into a chaotic state, but if it does, it has a very high impact.
Yeah, no, definitely, no, absolutely, and that's just to raise that, as you brought that up, Luke. 2015, 26,000 Canadian. If anyone noticed, I'm from Canada, so that's why I'm bringing up some Canadian references. 26,000 Canadian construction workers were injured on the job. 186 were fatally injured. And this article I pulled up here, hit by flying or falling objects, was one in the top 5 of incidents. Right. So the fact that we're spotting this and we're drawing into question, right, is something that, the risk is obvious, right? The consequences could be catastrophic and, if not, fatal, or have multiple fatalities involved. But how to manage it is because you can set in complicated and clear sort of risk management procedures and boundaries and conditions. But it's the human sort of anthro-complex behavior patterns of adhering to that and actually having the discipline to actually follow it through under the pressures of meeting time commitments and payments and all that. Now you start to really overlay the layers of clear, complicated, complex sort of pressure dynamics of that environment, right?
Yeah. And if I make one more comment about the weather, so typically we would find on a union site, they will shut down at the hint of bad weather. And large cranes like that will typically have high wind sensors in them. So they'll have some sort of weather vane on top of them that will result in a shutdown. So generally we wouldn't see that as being a significant risk on a site like that.
Cool. Anyone else
So
like to share?
Yeah, I would just add that there are people on site, and people's nervous systems are unpredictable, and a loud noise, something falling may startle somebody, may lead to a chain of events. In the Netherlands, I'm actually aware where an unpredictable lightning strike caused havoc on a construction site. You know, nobody was aware that the weather was doing this. It was just accidental. So,
yeah. Several others on the call here. Anyone else can share some of the observations made?
As I mentioned at the beginning, if you don't want to be recorded but you want to ask Michael a question, type it into the chat and one of us will read it to him, or he can read it himself.
Yeah, I pulled it up as well.
I actually just have a quick question, just to sort of piggyback on what Bourgeois just said. So there are all those people, and I was all over the map with that one. I mean, I was in the clear domain, and then I was kind of flirting with the complicated domain. And I was just wondering how you actually coded that. I just wanted to hear your actual thinking on that, because mine, I ultimately put it in the complicated domain just because there are so many Swiss we can make this work. I don't know. I was just curious how you did it.
Kit, you just glitched out there a little bit. Can you repeat the last 5-10 seconds?
Yeah, I was just saying how all of the individuals on the site, where there's so many people, but I assume they're all professional, hardworking individuals, and it might be able to work like a Swiss watch, and that's great. But that's the way I saw it. I was just wondering how you coded it.
Yeah, no. So that links to one in particular hazard I picked up on the complex domain, although it's probably linked to something more general. But trip hazards, right? Someone might say that trip hazards is obvious and clear, right? Especially if it's illuminated. But people's, conscious awareness of the choice of, say, running down, moving a bit too quickly, or as you're carrying a load, right? If you notice, there's that interesting segment that's actually on a second screen of mine right now, still cycling, where the coordination of 4 workers had to probably lift a heavy object and put it into place, maybe a heavy piece of rebar or something, I'm not sure, is sort of those boundaries of self sort of behavior where we're not paying attention, right? Because it's a slips, trips, and falls is a significant construction safety issue. But we can't put barriers and protections. It's just the cost effectiveness of managing is there. But what the complex bit is what triggers people to be less aware, less attentive, right? And I think what's also fascinating looking at this time-lapse video as a whole is just the degree of coordination, organization, right? Some of it's clear and obvious, but the fact that this is quite a complicated construction site, perhaps not to someone that works in that field. It's probably, I hope reasonably well laid out. There's coordination there, but the complex issue comes into play is where does people's behavior patterns operate outside the influence or the boundaries of all of these risk protection mechanisms, right? In such a way that could trigger harm or some sort of injury, right? So that's really, and that's what we refer to in our work is the anthrocomplex element and component, right? If there are breaches to rule structures and work procedures that then precipitate or was part of the factor that resulted in someone being injured, what influenced that? And can we do something in our work environment which actually mitigates the probability of that occurring, right? So that's really one of the key things that I was looking at. Does that illuminate a little bit, Kit, what your question and curiosity is about all of these people on this site?
Yeah, it does. I just really wanted to hear how you thought about it. I mean, ultimately, it's all an unknown, maybe even an unknown. You don't even know. I just wanted to hear how you thought about it. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, and everything on this site, like even if you look at the other things, the reason it was easier to put things on the clear domain, the walking routes, right, and how they're laid out in the barricades is dealing with a clear risk. High vis vests, right? It's just a very clear and obvious that recognizing that we need to be aware of our movements, because if everyone comes on site and you have clothing that kind of blurs into the background, is your periphery is not paying attention. So we have a lot of, in high risk environments, I think we have a lot of risk mitigation protections in place, right? That make, to the non-experienced person, make navigating this construction site, especially when it's in operating mode, active mode, at high risk to us, because we have not been trained about how to work within the rule structures and the confines that are there, right? So any other comments before we go on to sort of the next step of exploring this a bit further? Because I want to take another tact on having a look. No? Okay, so what I want to do now is come back to, I want to link this to the principles. So one of the key points I wanted to raise with that is this, the nice thing about this time lapse is it kind of gives you a vantage point of the whole system. If we say that this part of this construction site or this construction site is the whole system, right? Because we've got probably, I mean, I'm guessing here right now, 80 to 100 workers on site, right? At least the ones that we can see. We've got a lot of complicated, dynamically moving machinery, and we have a lot of different work tasks that are underway. So the first point is made clear is how do we work with the whole of the system, right? And not just looking at the obvious and clear risks, but we have mechanisms to manage the complicated risks. Little less so now. I want to start to shift maybe the attention to how do we potentially manage the complex risks. Anyone, I'm the one that shared one or two complex risks. Does anyone else want to share anything that they identified as complex risks before we go into this conversation? No? Did anyone have write anything down on complex? What's the complex risk on the site like that? No. Okay. So if we then take my word for it and say that human sort of dynamic and behavior pattern, which we cannot manage as if it's a complicated or a clear risk, is a potential risk. So remember my point in the chapter is we working with safety professionals, a lot of them identified that human factors, right, and unexpected behaviors, oftentimes in violation of expected work procedures, were contributing factors to serious incidents. So if we get that, how can we understand the present state, right, in its entirety, and looking at it from different vantage perspectives? So how do we actually understand the present state more? And what are and the way I want to maybe explore this is bring up the video again but ask you to look at and this is just a simple brainstorm. You don't have to map this on the Cynefin framework, but identify different types of perspectives, right, that might give you a sense of the current operating state of that environment. Does that make sense? What are the different perspectives that you could see in this video that if we had the ability to sort of hold and understand, that would give you a better sense of the operating state that the system's in? Is everyone clear on that ask? Anyone unclear? Any questions for clarity?
So far, so good.
So far, so good. Okay, let me bring up the video again. It's still playing. And let's take about 5 minutes, but just do a brainstorm. We might not need 5 minutes, but as soon as you're done, let's say as soon as you get, let's stretch a little. See if we can identify 10 perspectives that you might think would be helpful in understanding the operating, sort of the present state and the dispositionality of that system. Okay, and what I'm talking about is we're looking at that anthrocomplex lens that we talked about earlier. Is everyone clear? Okay, let's change it over. I will make this the spotlight. All right, you can start the timer, Barbara.
Once again, I became mesmerized by the video. So we have about 30 seconds left.
Sounds good.
This is great, Michael. It's almost as good as like cat videos.
I didn't know how it was going to work. No, actually, it's the first time, and some of these tasks is the first time I'm doing them too, so I'm doing them along with you. Oh, I missed that one. Jeez.
Okay. I'm calling it.
All right, I'm going to turn the spotlight off. Remove spotlight. I like to see as many of you. Thank you for those that are sharing your cameras. I appreciate that. And no worries on those who can't. I know it's difficult. I'll bring myself back. Yay. All right. How many got at least 10? Did you get 10? No? 5 or more? A few more hands. At least 3? Jocko's got a suit on, so I don't know what he's doing. All right, who wants to share a couple of perspectives? So the task is can you observe in there all the different perspectives that are helpful to give us an understanding of the current operating state?
Yeah, I had one interesting one that I don't think we touched upon in the earlier question. We had the foreground site and the background site, and it's almost like they weren't mirror images of each other. I think the background site had less space to work in and only one crane. So for all we know that they were, already saying something about, oh, look at the foreground site, they have 2 cranes. How stupid is that? That's a safety hazard. So even in this exercise, it made me think, okay, that they're working in parallel, but they're actually rather completely different due to the crane and due to the space. So I think that gives a bunch of perspectives right there.
Perspective there. Okay, so what I read from that, Matt, is it's interesting because if the work sites are related, there might be a flow of workers that cross over, right? From one perspective, when you come over, you're actually going to bring a fresh perspective. It's a different site. You might bring a slightly different lens. Okay, I get that. Who wants to share? Come on, we got more than everyone has probably at least one perspective written down.
I'll share one.
Thanks, Luke.
So I looked at it from the perspective of the road is partially closed potentially. So the city government probably gave a permit to close the road. Normal road users are probably going to complain to the city. The city then complains to the construction company, which puts pressure on the schedule, which could then result in unsafe behavior. So I looked at it from that perspective.
Wow, I didn't go that removed, but that's, so what you're saying there, it's interesting is there's a perspective that's influencing the site, right? That how people look at this site, and then it's actually, it's almost like a second order or an external one. Because if I'm a worker on the ground doing a task, right, there might be a cascading impact on what I feel on my work environment, but it's like 2 or 3 orders removed. I can just make note of that one. Okay, any others you wrote down that are helpful to understand the operating environment?
I think another perspective is the family of the workers, the perspective. So we used to say to our staff, there is no job sort of so important that it can't be done safely, and everyone has the right to stop work. And we would constantly emphasize that this is about going home safely at the end of the day to see your family. So again, that's a perspective that the workers should perhaps take into consideration.
Hold that in your mind, because it's this, I'm building up to something that we'll link to. That's cool. Yeah, because I missed the family one. I should have picked up on that one.
And you can also reverse that by saying that for the construction company, that they could bring the families in by having, by sending videos, or by, mobilize them so that the person who actually works on the site has at home an environment that also says, are you wearing your helmet, etc. And I work with a company where they actively involve the family every year on an annual safety day.
There was fairly famous story for those of you who followed Dave Snowden's talks, a project that he did many, many years ago with IBM. It was done actually in New Zealand, where they were founding a lot of high degree of safe practices amongst lorry or truck drivers, right? So they created a sort of a family fun day where most of the drivers, it was predominantly a male work environment. So mostly fathers, and the fathers had to train their kids how to do this fun little exercise where they had to pack around buckets of open pails of paint, right? And it was a race, so they had to get it done. So the race was sort of a metaphor for a high compressed, schedule pressured work environment, right? And they had to get the task done, so they had some pressure on that. And the fathers were responsible for communicating and training their sons or daughters would operate these go-kart type like trucks and to get around. And the objective is not only the fastest, but least, you don't want no spilled paint, because the paint was in essence acid or nasty stuff for the environment. And then they observed, and they were actually making comments about what their children did effectively and safely versus where they violated it, right? And what it was is an indirect trigger mechanism. It was a safe to fail, because maybe that could then influence how they're paying attention or not paying attention, becoming complacent in their work environment, right? So that's an example of that. So bringing that family perspective. Barbara.
I was looking at it from the perspective of the different sort of types of workers on the scene. So that, you've got employees, you've got contractors, you've got subcontractors, you've got skilled craftsmen. Yeah, because I was thinking of that because those big cranes, I mean, I don't know what it's like in other places, but here in New York, those big cranes are often booked a year in advance. So if they're on your site, whatever they need to do to get their part of the job done, that's what's driving everything, because they have to move on to the next job at a very specific time.
Absolutely.
And so like those levels of things, and I could see that there were obviously some skilled craftsmen in there. There were guys whose only job was to unload and load. And then there were these various contractors and subcontractors wandering around doing their very specific kinds of jobs. And they all bring a very different perspective to questions of safety, site safety in particular. And delivery, people like delivery men, delivery guys and things like that floating in and out, that, they all have a different perspective on this and a different way of implementing safe procedures.
Cool. Anyone else, please? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes. Bernie, the food vendor, in particular, what happens if he doesn't show up? People on the site having come to depend upon him. And suddenly, whether it's a personal holiday or he came down sick or he's observing the start of Ramadan. And speaking of which, then, depending upon where the site is and the ethnicity of the different workers, the impact of Ramadan on the overall site.
Yeah. Was there a food vendor in the video, though?
Yes.
Where was he?
Towards, I don't know he or she, but there's an umbrella, a tricolored umbrella of the type that one would typically see it, for instance, in New York on a hot dog stand or something like that, towards the right hand, not quite 1/3 of the way from the background.
Yeah. I had that noted, but I interpreted that as maybe some sort of security gate for site access.
Under an umbrella?
And the colorful umbrella was just, sun protection because someone brought it from home. But I could be totally wrong, right? But either way, what's interesting is whether that's a food vendor or a security site, right? The person or persons operating in there have a view, a perspective on the work that's actually happening. And part of that view and perspective, let's say they're a food vendor, part of that is through casual, informal chatter that they're involved in as they're providing a service to the site workers, right? So just like a family member has an insight, I think, as you mentioned, Luke, as an insight into the attitudes and what's influencing sort of the mood and the morale, the attention of the worker that's going day in and day out, and maybe they're working long hours because there's schedule pressure to get reach a certain stage on the building construction, right? The family members have a perspective on the worker that's entering the site. Because the intent of the task is what perspectives are valuable to understand the present state of the complex operating environment. And if we know that, if we understand we're working and living in a world that's highly influenced by our interactions, right? I got an adult daughter and a teenage son at the moment. Adult daughter, she's on her own now, right? Well, not quite. But the son, parents are generally concerned with is mostly about when their children are transitioning to adulthood, is who are they interacting with? What's the nature of the relationships? Because the relationships influence how they see the world, their attitudes, and most of concern is what are their behavior patterns, right? Because you don't want them to get, because they're, cognitively their inhibition circuits and everything they start to experiment and whatever, and you don't want them to put themselves at risk, and they're most influenced by the attitudes. So what are the vantage points that you see on this site that can give us a deeper sense of what's happening? Does anyone else want to share before I'm just keeping an eye on the clock, and we're going to end here in 15, 20 minutes, unless we can stay on if I could take a few questions. But anyone else want to share before I share some of my list?
I looked at it from a very specific sort of thinking about the actual vantage point of how much of the site someone could see. So some of the delivery guys were only seeing, their truck and their specific stop along the way. Then you had all the folks who are sort of in the middle of the site who were doing the unloading and moving materials and equipment around. And they also can really only see what their team is doing, maybe interacting a little bit with other teams that are in that vicinity. And then you have the crane operators who are at a much higher height and actually can see the entire site sort of laid out and everything going on and sort of the interactions between teams and see how that flows. I don't think anyone could see over to the other site, and I don't think that the traffic could see much. It looks like there was a barrier to prevent them from really seeing anything, but what you could actually physically see sort of changing depending on where you are.
Yeah, no, that's fantastic, because it's and before I share, because I had several of those as well. But did anyone else catch anything else before I share a few? It's not going to be earth shattering, so don't expect a drum roll here.
Oh, go on, Michael. You know you want to.
No one else? Did you pick up anything, Matt? Matt, did you share? Any of those who don't have cameras on, please speak up. Geez, I thought your New York meetup was really boisterous, Barbara and Jocko.
We're sitting in anticipation of hearing all of the insights.
Mine's really pragmatic, and I'm really, really happy that Rebecca shared, because that's exactly what I looked at it. Is I said, look, what is the system that we're looking at here? And where are the boundaries of this system that we're trying to understand its dispositionality? So if I'm the safety manager that's ultimately responsible for the safe working environment on this construction site, I want to have as many eyes as possible from different perspectives, observing and helping me and helping the group that is engaged in working on this project do the works very safely and have zero incidents. I mean, ultimately, we want goal zero, and we want to maintain that safe operating environment. So I looked at it very much like Rebecca did, is the red crane operator, and then looking at the floor, the actual workers on site. And there's a sort of the major floor there, whether it's a level in the multi-level garage that's below the surface level, right? There's all the different work cells, and if you pay attention in the work cells, there's actually the predominant number of people are doing the work, but then there are some observers walking around coordinating between different areas, right? So those are, worker supervisor perspectives. The delivery drivers, the passersby a little bit, but they're probably not going to have a deep insight unless they happen to be a passerby that's walking by frequently. And then I also started to extend, in the video, there's the upper left corner with the lunchroom trailers and probably the planner managers. And, it's usually the trailers, one or more of the trailers has all the blueprints and the paper copies and the different material requisition, the office workers. So they represent a perspective because they're interacting with the site, but they're not sort of at that cold face of the work being done, right? But they're interacting with people that are in and out of the trailers. Then there was sort of context of, there is the viewpoint, the vantage point at different levels. And the crane operator, Rebecca, is a really interesting one because there's 2-3 crane operators if we have 3 cranes. And if on these heavy lift cranes, their actual work time is very low relative to the shift. If they're really busy and they have a lot of heavy lifts coming stacked one another, there might be a period of an hour or two that we're quite busy, but oftentimes they're sitting idly, right? And they're probably reading a newspaper or whatever, or on their iPhones or whatnot. But they're also observing the site, and they've got a unique vantage point where they can see things happening on the site from a completely different perspective. And there's also what I noticed is at the periphery, at the edges, is there are oftentimes little groups of people that you can tell they're probably a supervisor or an engineer, where they're standing with a couple of other people, and they're having having a chat about what's happening, right? So they're observing, but they're also interacting and having that conversation. And then the other thing is, I was thinking is temporally, where is the chatter happening? So there's certain chatter happening. People are making observations and helping as work is being done. But then there's break times, lunchroom chatter. It's perhaps if the colorful umbrella is a food vendor, there's people talking to the food vendor, right? So you can those give an insight of what's happening on that site. So really understanding the dispositionality of a system, if we know that the human system is going to be our best understanding of picking up on weak signals, how do we actually give people, in essence, like a metaphor I used earlier, is give everyone a little whistle so they can actually make alerts, but make alerts in a way that can aggregate so we could pay attention. And that's one of the things why those that follow our work at Cognitive Edge, that's why we actually make narrative capture and conversations, preferably if you have to do it in large quantity, to do it with software assisted. Our platform is called SenseMaker. But if you don't use a software assisted form, is how do you actually stimulate conversations in those work environments in a way that you illuminate these weak signals, right? In a way that the conversation can happen so that the awareness of the workers, right, is heightened. And sometimes their awareness of their bias, or they're disrupted the bias, so that when they're on the site, they're actually paying attention in a way that's going to reduce harm and reduce risk. And that's fundamentally how we feel on the third element is how we inform small actions. Is how do we interact those connections? How do we entangle those different perspectives in a way that the awareness of the workers is heightened, and the triggering of sort of the sensitivity to alerts is raised when it needs to, before you have any serious accident or injury on site. And that's where we believe that the Cynefin framework and putting to the anthro-complexity strengths of the system into play can help sites become safe operating environments, or much safer operating environments. So that's the sort of the big sort of perspectives that we're trying to bring things at play.
Can I jump on that for a moment?
Yep. Please.
Because you're sort of addressing it, and I had to step away because I had my kid asking me for iPads, surprisingly. So if you guys covered it, forgive me. One of the things is I'm an agile coach within organizations, and one of the things that I'm picking up on The thing about the crane or the work site or most of the stuff that we're picking up on are visual cues. We're looking for things with our eyes. Whereas in the organization, what I'm more interested in or what I'm paying close attention to is, you could call the culture, but I don't even call it that. It's the environment, the pressures. Say the example that Barbara gave before about those cranes got to leave. So there is time boxes here that increases the pressure, that also increases the likelihood for mistakes to be made because of the time pressures. There's all sorts of dependencies on a work site like this as well. There's all sorts of things that could come into play, such as pay or unions or, where you're getting the workers from. There's all sorts of external things that aren't visual at all. And I think that you touched upon that with the narrative aspect of it, is where you would capture all that. But in terms of looking at the construction site, I didn't know what to look for. And so the only thing I could really think of is the socio, that what is the interactions among the people, which aren't really plain to see. So I was wondering if you had any comment on that.
Yeah, so I think if I understood what you're asking, Jocko, is there's not only observing the environment, right? And that's the challenge that comes in when you're actually gathering multiple observations, is then there's the lens and the biases that we bring into that play. Whether, depending on, someone mentioned earlier, we might have a worker group from a different cultural background, a different country, or even in non-English speaking type work environments, right? So that contributes to the complexity of that environment. And those might also present inhibitions to actually raise alerts, right? Because remember earlier when I started the talk is it's important to not only see the weak signals, but pay attention and act on them. And some of us might be familiar on this call, way back when with Korean Airlines, it had 1 or 2 incidents, right? And they found that they had cultural inhibitions in the cockpit where the second in command would never challenge the first in command, right? And they took drastic measures, because if you think about it, if the market does not see you addressing that, if you lose confidence with your flyers on your airline, I mean, you're as good as, it may as well just shut down and sell off your assets, right? Because you're not going to be able to operate. And I think at that time, they actually ended up firing majority, if not all, their Korean pilots, and they brought in non-Korean pilots, right, to just make a statement to the market that we found that this was the problem. It was cultural, but we had to take dramatic interventions to actually offset that confidence risk that we had with our customer base, right?
That's right.
I think so. What's interesting now is we took predominantly, and me included, took perspectives of a vantage point. But then that's where diversity and the whole understanding of the value of diversity and inclusion in work environments, there's actually a real strength in organizational awareness and collective sense making that a diversity of perspectives that brings to that environment. One of my friends was actually part of the safety management team or safety consulting group that advised, I think, one of the largest gas to liquids plants in the Middle East in Qatar. And they had, at their peak, I think they had 80,000 construction site workers from something ridiculous, like, I'm sure 14 or 15 different countries, right? Because being Middle East, all the workers were coming in from overseas. And they had an impeccable safety record on that construction project, impeccable. Right. But I think that's, in that case, is they managed the interface, the anthro-complexity elements, along with the very complicated and very clear safety management and operating instructions in that construction site, which is highly, risk fraught. Like, I mean, these are high risk environments. I mean, just look at the one that we watched here. How many moves of that one large crane, right? And all the different things that are happening in that building site. And that's where I think the benefit is of working with that deep sort of sense of that environment yields a significant benefit.
Yeah, because one of the perspectives we're missing as well is like the neighbors, right? Like if I have to drive down that street and it's blocked off, if I live somewhere noise adjacent or inconvenience adjacent to the site, all of this impacts me as well as all of these other people. And as someone who lives in the middle of 4 different ongoing construction projects, nobody cares about us.
Mm.
Well, by extension, upper management of the construction firm, a new CEO comes in and takes less of an interest in safety for whatever reason to drop the bottom line or whatever. All of those have impacts all across the board, but they're difficult to locate or to isolate or to whatever you want to deal with those kinds of things because you're operating within a complex system, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And what we're advocating too, to understand the current state and the dispositionality of the system, because the dispositionality isn't something that's fixed. It's something that is living, dynamic, and fluid. It has probably, if you have a strong worksite culture, has some strong patterns that are repeating. But because it's fluid and dynamic, is you need to monitor continuously. So having sort of, these rituals and safety talks and, toolbox, what are some of the companies I work with up here in Canada have, tailgate conversations, right? They're entering a high risk job function. They're getting strapped on with your PPE, your equipment, right? And you're having a conversation and you're almost going through some rituals of rehearsing what you're getting into. From an anthropology perspective, what's happening in there is you're actually doing a ritual transition from being a casual worker in that environment to actually taking on the role of maybe being a pole high voltage lineman that's got to scale this transmission tower and do a fix on the job. And that identity switch is absolutely critical, right? So, but the conversation, what we're saying is if you want to monitor an environment and really take a proactive approach at managing the complexities of that environment, is you need to get systematic about how you can capture at least a partial but a deeper awareness of the things that you're observing and experiencing, right? That's why the crane operators offer really interesting observers. They're presenting a view on other workers, so they're observing other workers doing work, right? So if you're doing the work in that pit or in that level of the building, you will not see things of yourself that an observer, a coworker might see things in what you're doing, right? So how do we bring that shared awareness?
I'm curious if there's been any work done on harnessing the self-awareness, to whatever extent there is self-awareness of the workers in nonverbal reporting. I suddenly flashed, as you were talking earlier, to as you leave Italy, there's these little kiosks where you can hit everything from a sad face to a happy face. And it just seemed like something like that as you were exiting a construction site, it would be a weak signal, but if you suddenly got a few more unhappy faces as people were leaving or as people were arriving, that could be a signal that there's something going on at the construction site that needs attention.
There's work that use those type of real simple sort of feedback mechanisms. I remember traveling, and this is not a safety environment, but traveling through London Heathrow back in the days when we were traveling, right, and had the happy face, smiley face, and the sad face, and one or two other options. The problem there is it's not granular enough. So give that point an example as I deplaned, right, and maybe I was a little upset at the attendant on the bridge to the airway, but maybe they did something that held us up, and I didn't think that was necessary. But I really liked, passport control and how this one lady really kind of helped me get through quickly because I was in a priority queue, or she gave me rights. So those two situations is now, how do I nullify? How do I average out? Do I share my pissed off, attitude about what happened on the bridge for when the airplane was deplaning? Or do I share the positive experience of passport control? So our argument is a lot of those tools are not granular enough to absorb the variety of situations occurring. So what we try to do to understand the dispositions of the system is also take into account different contexts. So we looked at this work environment in this short video, and I don't think I didn't spot any accidents. There weren't any accidents, but there was many different experiences, right? There might have been some things that are happening there that were near misses that we didn't really spot. I mean, some of us speculate that the overhead crane was flying over people, or people who are walking, breaching sort of drop zones. But we don't know, but the people present there know. And some will spot that and some won't spot that. So how do we get systematic at capturing the diversity of contexts? Because a sufficient sample from people contributing observations. So take safety meetings, right? Daily safety meeting before you get on site, you have a conversation. People said, what went well yesterday? Was there near, incidents before? If we get systematic at capturing that, maybe someone on the crew is responsible for these 2 weeks to make some entries, right? So on the lunchroom, they get off site 20 minutes early because they got to make a few observations, and then they hand off that observer capacity to another person. And you've got a crew of people that are rotating, making observations. I now have an ability to absorb the dynamic, complex variety of what's happening on site. And if all of a sudden, a whole bunch of people that are on these crews are all signaling that one work area, which happens to have some new hires or some new contractors come in, there's multiple perspectives that are saying, hey, we got to be concerned there. There's potentially a risk that might be emerging there. Now I can pay attention. I can take action on it, right? So we got to get, I think, systematic at using, our strengths as human beings to make these observations and engage workers in a more meaningful conversation. I don't think in this type of environment, a smiley face or a sad face is going to give you sort of the alerts that are necessary in the context that you need to be aware. Oh, 8 minutes. Geez, well, we ran 2 hours here. Luke, I know you had a few questions queued up. I'm wondering if you want to raise any of them now before we end, or anyone else, please.
I think you answered a lot of my thoughts really well. It's a very interesting conversation and a very interesting way to present the ideas. One observation might be that a lot of where I've seen risks realized is in lower level, very small subcontractors. And I'm wondering, with the method of capture that you've mentioned, it might work really well in a factory where everyone's employed by one company, but it might be harder to make it work in a environment where there's lots of different subcontractors that are turning over quickly, or in the environment that I've worked in the past, which is 13,000 cell sites spread across the US, and it's one team of 5 guys coming to that site with a real impetuous to finish it quickly. And that's why I believe that I've seen the breakdown of these clear safety regulations. I think it is because of those incentives and those drivers. So I think it would be interesting to see how it works in that more distributed environment. But I really think what you mentioned would work in a factory or a smaller, more contained environment.
We're actually, I mean, I acknowledge the challenge that some of these smaller group settings work, but we're just deploying, I'm engaging one of the government agencies here in Canada on wildfire management. And what we're trialing with them is an emergency response learning tool of how do I capture sort of observations, experiences of emergency responders as proximate to the emergency that they dealt with, right? Because obviously, while they're in you have a paramedic that's dealing with an accident, you have a wildfire fighter that's dealing with a bushfire or a forest fire that's out of control or breached the line. Is you really can only capture the sort of experiences post-event. So what we're talking with these crews is if you get a sampling of your crews contributing reflective sort of learnings, say a day after or that end of shift or something, because a lot of these, especially in wildfire situations, they're in the bush, they're in camps, right? And how do we capture a sufficient flow? And these are just short little snippets, something that was effective and how they maybe had an impact on the fire line, or maybe when they saw some mistakes, they were part of some mistakes and challenges. So, to not collect anything is, I think, doing a disservice to the complexity of that human behavior. So there's a way of trying to tap into those touch points, whether you use software assisted methods or simply look at how do you stimulate conversations in a way that people can become both individually more aware, self-aware, but as a group self-aware of how, because no one wants to be on a job, right, where they're actually, God forbid, carrying out a mate that went down, and they have to go to the family and say they're not going to be coming home at the extreme, and no one wants to have a serious incident happen when they're on the job, right? So how do you actually bring that type of awareness? Because you can't manage all hazards. We cannot, put in protective barriers that makes all workers safe in those environments. So how do we stimulate the people's awareness in a different way? Kit, someone else had a question. Kit, was that you that was aiming to ask? No? Okay. Barbara, I think with 5 minutes remaining, hand back to you.
Well, Michael, this has been amazing. I mean, you gave us 2 hours of just so much to think about, and things I hadn't thought about before. I mean, it's interesting. Jocko and I were talking earlier today before this, and I said, as an American, for me, all questions of safety are funneled through the lens of liability. And what I see Luke is laughing. This is, I see the giggles, but that is another aspect of this that we haven't touched upon, and maybe that's a conversation for another day, she said winningly. But the idea that a lot of the initiatives that you see are companies trying to prevent themselves from being liable for workplace accidents, and that dictates the safety protocols.
Yeah. No, it's
more than what's actually happening. Yeah. And that, I've been in meetings in companies about psychological safety, going, well, but isn't our goal to protect these people? And it's like, no, we have to create a situation where we're not liable under Title X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, okay, so we can just keep going on that. But that is, I think, a whole other sort of fascinating aspect of this that we haven't touched on. And so maybe sometime you'll come back and talk about that. We cannot thank you enough, all of you. If you have more questions for Michael, reach out to Jocko or I through the meetup, and we'll funnel them to him. Clap.
Yay, thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Michael.
And if you have interest, reach out. There's active work going on in this space. I'm collaborating with Gary Wong and Marion Keeley about creating team learning initiatives that will then stimulate awareness amongst workers. So there's ways we want to touch upon this, but that's an important point, Barbara. Liability, and especially in some countries where directors are now liable. Some of those environments, it's sad to say, but they don't want deep insights, right?
Well,
because it exposes risk.
I had a very interesting conversation with Marion a couple of years ago, because we were talking about, I have a lot of relatives who work in the police and the fire and the EMT and all of that jazz, and they won't bring forward problems or issues that they see, because they say, well, someday those assholes will try to use that against me.
Yeah.
So there's an active cultural resistance to reporting, to acknowledging, because they feel like politically it will put them in a bad position and a vulnerable position within the job.
Yeah. Complex issues get more complex, don't they?
Yes, they do. But we here at the Complexity Meetup cannot thank you enough for your time and energy. We really appreciate this. You have done an amazing job, and you are welcome back anytime.
I'll look forward to joining you guys, and reach out, please, if you have questions or follow up. Happy to take a call with you one-on-one.
And thanks to all of you for coming. Come back. On May 25th, Chris Corrigan will be presenting on constraints. What kind of constraints? I'm not going to tell you right now. But there will be a discussion of constraints on May 25th. So hold the date. Thank you again, everyone. Michael, thank you. We appreciate this more than you'll know. Jocko, anything you need to say?
No, it's probably best that I don't. But thanks a lot, Michael. Certainly appreciate it.
We all feel that way, Jocko.
I know, that's why I said it. But thanks everybody for joining us too. So we appreciate it.
Thanks everyone for your time. Really appreciate the engagement.
Hey guys, thanks for having me. I appreciated it. Thanks.
Awesome.
Guys.
Thanks a lot.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Michael.